Hey, what's going on? It's Andrew Mead from Mead.io, and in this video, we're going to learn about Formik. Formik is a library that makes it really easy to create and work with forms in React. Now, obviously, we do not need a third-party library to create forms in React. React gives us everything we need to do that. We have all of the markup necessary to create our buttons, our fields, our forms, and we can add props to those JSX elements to do things when someone interacts with the form, when they submit the form, when they change a value, when they click off of a field, all sorts of cool stuff. The problem is not that React can't do this stuff, it's that when we set up a real-world form with just React, we end up with something a bit more complex than we probably want. So right here, we have a very basic form. Notice it doesn't have stuff like validation, things that we're going to have in any real-world form. There's quite a bit of boilerplate code here already, considering that we don't have a lot of features that we would need to add in. We have things like handle change, we have our constructor because we're using local component state. All of this is going to live in not just this component, but any component where we do create a form. Now you might say, okay, we can just create a function that abstracts this away, and that's true, but at that point you're getting dangerously close to just creating your own library that you now need to test and maintain. My goal in this video is to convince you to actually just use a third-party library designed to make forms easy to build. Now Formik, the library that we're going to be using, is not alone in this space. There are other great libraries. The most notable is Redux Form. Redux Form, as the name suggests, does require you to use Redux, but it is a great tool. Even when I am using Redux, though, I don't find myself using Redux Form because my form fields, the values that users type in that's local state. I don't need that in my global Redux store. So while Redux Form stores it in that Redux store, Formik stores it locally using the higher order component model. So this is the library that I prefer regardless of whether I'm using Redux in that application or not. So what we're going to do is go ahead and actually set this up. And we're also going to be using another library for validation called Up. When we use these two together, we're going to be able to create real-world forms without all of the boilerplate or dependencies that we would have otherwise. So let's go ahead and kick things off. And we're actually just going to use code sandbox.io for this. You're more than welcome to use something locally, whether it's your own boilerplate or create React app. We're really just going to be working with a single component in this one. So this sandbox website is going to work perfectly fine. I'm just going to make a new sandbox. I'm going to work off of their React boilerplate, and then we're just going to add our dependencies on the left-hand side. I'm going to give this one a name, Formik mini course, and we're going to add our two dependencies. These are dependencies that we would install with yarn or npm if we were working locally. We're just going to add them right in here. First up is Formik, and second up is Up. I'm using Formik version 0.10.4, and I'm using Up version 0.23.0. React and React DOM have already been included for me. Now we can go ahead and clean up this boilerplate. I am going to remove the hello.js file since we're just going to have a single component. I'm then going to collapse the left-hand sidebar, and we're going to gut this boilerplate real quick. I'm going to remove the styles object as well as the hello import. And then for the app component, we're just going to start off with something very simple. I'm going to start off with a div. And in that div, all we're going to do is set up some static text. So right here, test text. And as long as we can get that showing up, then we're ready to continue on and actually use Formik. I am also going to take a quick moment to delete all semicolons that are unnecessary. I've been doing that lately, and I have been enjoying that a bit more than typing those semicolons in, which don't serve a purpose in most cases. So there we have it. We have our starter project, and we're going to go ahead and actually go through the process of making a form. We're going to make a sign-up form with an email field, a password field, but instead of just having text fields, we're also going to explore some other fields. We'll work in a checkbox for, say, a newsletter sign-up opt-in, and we'll also work in a select drop-down if we're going to have someone maybe pick a plan when they sign up. So sure, it's contrived, but I want to cover as much real-world stuff as possible. First up, let's go ahead and import some stuff from Formik and Up. Now, for the moment, we're just going to grab a single thing off of Formik. It's a named export, so I'm going to import inside of curly braces. The named export is with Formik. And I'm going to grab that from Formik. Next up, we're going to grab something from Up, import Up, the default export from Up. And we're going to go ahead and use yup later on. I'm just going to import it at the moment. So the goal is to use with Formik to create a higher order component. So there are a few requirements to actually get any value out of this. You have to know the basics of forms in React. If you've never created a form, it's going to be unclear why something like Formik is useful. And I'm also going to require that you know about higher order components, which you most likely do. If you've ever worked with React Router or Redux before, you've probably stumbled across them. Things like the connect function from React Redux, that creates a higher order component. It's a version of your component connected to the Redux store. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to leave app as a functional component, and we're going to connect it to Formik via this higher order component by calling with Formik. So right here, I'm going to make a const called Formik app. You can pick any naming convention that you like. I typically just prefix my component name with Formik, and then I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to, I'm going to call with Formik. I'm going to call it, and I'm going to pass in an options object. And this object is where we're going to define basically everything: what our initial values are, how we're going to handle validation, what to do when the form gets submitted. All of that will live right here. What we're going to do before we fill out anything is actually wire it up to work with the app component from above. So with Formik, like most of those higher order component third-party libraries, returns a function. We need to call that function right here with the component, in this case, app. Now we can go ahead and actually render down below Formik app instead of app, and this is going to allow us to set up the form. So let's kick things off with a single input. We're going to have an input for our email field. Right here, we can remove test text, and we can start knocking that one out. It's going to be an input. I am going to stick with a type equal to email, a name equal to email, and we'll wrap things up with a placeholder equal to uppercase E, email. Perfect. Now, all of these attributes, type name and placeholder, they all come from HTML. They're not specific to JSX or Formik, but it is important to note that the name value is used by Formik as your unique identifier for this field. So we're going to use it here, and we're going to use it a lot down below anytime we're working with individual field values. So now that we do have the basic input rendered to the screen, what I want to do is actually start using Formik. We're going to take a look at the docs and figure out how we can set up the first thing we have to set up, which is the initial values for things like email or any other field we might have. The Formik docs are really good, but they're a little tricky to work with because the table of contents is actually hidden quite a bit down the page. If we scroll down past some basic examples, we can get to the table of contents, which actually links to stuff above. Doesn't really make sense. Anyways, what we really want to focus on is the API section, which defines exactly what Formik gives you. For the moment, we're going to scroll down to with Formik. It's one of the last items in the API docs area. And in here, we have all of the options we can provide. These are all things we can set up on that options object. And the first one is map props to values. This is where we can set up the initial values for all of those fields. For things like a password or an email, it's probably going to be an empty string, but for other things, like whether or not you want to opt into the newsletter or the plan you want to set up, those are going to have different values, so it's important to have a place to set all of that up. Let's go ahead and use map props to values, and then actually wire it up to work with our email field. I'm going to switch back over to the editor. Right here on the options object, map props to values, and we're going to set this up as a function using the ES6 method definition syntax, and then all we need to do is return an object, and on this object we have key value pairs where the key is the input name. Notice I'm using email, which exactly matches the name value, and the value we type here is the initial value. So we can start it off as a string, but to make sure it's actually working, let's pick a different value like test text. So the goal is to get test text to show up when we first load the page. Right now, it is indeed still an empty value because we're not using any of the props that Formik passes down to our functional component. So what we're going to do is take those props, which would be the first argument, and we're just going to destructure them, grabbing a whole bunch of stuff off of them. And the first one is values. This contains the current values for all inputs. We can use this to actually render the inputs with the correct information. Now, when it comes to all of the props that you have access to, those also live over in the docs, just in a different location. So if we scroll all the way back up to the table of contents, what we're looking for is under API, Formik, and under there, Formik props. These are all of the things that you can destructure in that component. And we're just starting with the last one, which is values. And this is just an object with a bunch of key value pairs. So let's go ahead and actually use values. We've already destructured it. Down below, all we're going to do after I resize the browser is to set up value like we might do for a regular form using just React. And we're going to set value equal to, inside of our JavaScript expression, values dot, and here is where we provide the name for the field. We chose to call this one email. We set that up right here. So we're going to reference email here as well. Now, if I actually save the program, we should see that initial value showing up. It is indeed showing up, which is a great first step. But if you do try to change it, you'll notice that we've created a read-only field. We've provided the value prop without providing what to do on change. So with Formik, we don't have to create our own on change handler. It comes built in, and all we have to do is pass it down. Over inside of the docs, the prop that we're going to be using for this is handle change. To use handle change, we just have to get it. I'm going to destructure it. Then we provide it right here on change, setting it equal to handle change. Now I know what you're thinking. We're still creating a ton of stuff on each and every input. Is there any way to make this better? The answer is yes. We're going to get there in a little bit. For now, we're just focusing on getting the basics set up. So if we go ahead and save things as they currently stand, not only are we going to have that initial value, but we now also have handle change set up so we can actually change the value over here. Now my keystrokes are actually detected and I could type in my email. Now, most likely we're not going to start off with a value for something like email. It might make more sense for other fields, but it might also make sense if we have initial data. Imagine I have a screen where the user can either set things up for the first time, in which case the fields might be empty, or they can edit existing information, in which case the fields might be populated. We can actually set up map props to values to get props passed in to the component. So if I pass in email equals, and I get the email from the database, let's say it's andrew@test.io, we can go ahead and use this as the initial value. We get access to all of the props on map props to values. So we could take the props and we could go ahead and reference it, but I'm just going to destructure it, grabbing some stuff off of there, any props passed in here. In this case, we just have one email, so I can grab that. Then I can add a little bit of conditional logic. I can start off the email form value at the value for the prop if it exists, or an empty string if it doesn't exist. So with the current code, I would expect Andrew@test.io to show up. It does indeed show up, and I can indeed change it. If I were to leave this prop off, I would expect the field to start as an empty field. That is exactly what happens. I can type some new value in. So there we have it. We don't have a complete form just yet, but we do have our very first input set up. Before we go any further, what I want to do is just create a second one, a password input. Then we'll worry about actually doing something when the form gets submitted. I could break this input into multiple lines, but since we're actually going to be tweaking it fundamentally a bit later, I'm going to leave it as is. All I'm going to do for the password input is to take this entire line, paste it down below, and just tweak a few things. We're going to go from a type of email to a type of password to hide the text. I'm going to pick a new unique identifier. Otherwise, we are going to run into some issues with collision. Password. For the placeholder, we will stick with password uppercase P. The on-change handler is going to stay exactly the same. There is no need to change that for each individual input. That's boilerplate. We'll fix that later. And then right here, what we're going to do is grab values.password. Now, before we save, we probably do want to set up some sort of initial value. Once again, we could allow this to be passed in via props, and we can also start it off with a reasonable default otherwise. I'm going to set up password to use the password prop if it exists, otherwise use an empty string. And then all I need to do is destructure it alongside of email. Excellent. So we have our two fields in place, and now we can actually do something meaningful, like just log the values out when the form gets submitted. Right now, there isn't a submit button. We don't even have a form tag, so let's go ahead and fix that. I am going to start off by converting this root div over to a form. And then I'm going to add a button just below my inputs. And we can give that a text value of something along the lines of just submit. Now, for all of our forms we've ever set up without some sort of third-party library, we had an onSubmit function. This is where we define what we want to do when the form gets submitted. And Formik is no different, though instead of specifying what we want to do right here, we actually call a prop from Formik that allows it to do some stuff like validation as middleware. Then it eventually calls the function we defined down below. Let's see what that looks like. First up, we need a new prop. This one over in the docs is called handle submit. Handle submit lives right here. We can go ahead and destructure it. And handle submit, like handle change, is just something we're going to pass in. And then we're done with it. There's nothing else we can do with it. Now, down below, what we're going to do is actually set up what we want to do after Formik gets that submission. So right here, I am getting a little warning about something. Handle submit is not defined. Oh, good catch, ESLint. It's a capital S. Excellent. So down below, what we're going to do is actually have some code run when things do submit. Once again, half of the battle with a new library is the docs. So I want to show you where everything lives. Down below, we're going back to those with Formik options. This one is handle submit. The first argument that gets passed to it is our values object. That is what we're going to just dump to the screen for the moment. So let's go ahead and set up handle submit. Down below, right after map props to values, it's going to be handle submit. We are going to get the values as the first argument. And then for our purposes, we're just going to dump them to the screen. Although this is where you would do something like make a GraphQL request, make an HTTP request, or just run some JavaScript. I'm going to save things, and then we can play around with it. I will crack open the console that Code Sandbox gives us. I'll put in Andrew at test.io for the email, and I'll put in password 123 for the password. I'll submit the form, and right here we do get that information. So we have all of the data from the form getting changed and submitted, and when it is submitted, we can actually do something meaningful with it. Now at this point, we have a basic form similar to the one we've seen over here where we just run some code on submit, we account for changes, we account for values, and what we've done is we've created something like this, but in my opinion, something a whole lot cleaner to work with and expand. Now what I want to do is actually get to some real world advantages. What we're going to focus on for the next couple of minutes is how we can avoid using things like form and input and actually use a couple of components that Formik gives us. It's going to prevent the need for boilerplate like defining this here or these here. We're going to be able to create a much cleaner set of elements. Now, obviously, it's completely optional. As we've seen, we're able to still use the regular JSX elements and get everything done, but you do get some nice to haves when working with those components. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. First up is form. This component is going to be pretty much exactly the same for any form you'd ever create, which basically means that we should get it to as little as possible. There's no need to type on submit equals handle submit every single time. And we can actually do that. With Formik, we get access to the appropriately named form component, and all this is going to do is handle that for us. If we click it, it should bring us down to the documentation, and we can see that we use form right here. We put some stuff inside of it, and there's no need to define the actual onSubmit handler. You're seeing a use of a component called field down here. We're going to explore that in just a second, but let's start with form. Now, we're going to actually get form as a named export alongside of with Formik. That is capital F form, and all we're going to do is swap out the closing tag for uppercase F form to use that component right here and up above. And once we are using it, we can actually remove everything else there. We just have to open and close it. There's no longer a need for that prop since it can do it internally. Now we can actually remove the destructured handle submit as well. And if I save the form, things are going to refresh and we have the exact same functionality. I'll use A and P for my two values. I'll submit the form and we can see that we're actually getting some browser validation. So let me put in something that looks more valid. Perfect. We have our email, we have our password, everything is working even though we've switched over to the form component. So there's not a whole lot to work with form, pretty simple to use. The other one though is pretty awesome. It comes with a few more things we can actually do. So we're going to spend a little more time on that. It is field. We're also going to destructure this off of Formik. And what we're going to do is replace all of our inputs and later our checkboxes and our dropdowns with instances of field instead. So field, also in the documentation, is going to allow us to simplify the actual field we're creating. As you can see, we can still pass in the things that make the field unique, but other things like setting up the value or setting up our onChange handler, those go away. So I'm going to go back to the documentation, the table of contents up above. And we're just going to go ahead and link over to that. It's sitting right here, field, and they define everything that we can do with the field. There are quite a few different things we can do with it. Right here, we can see we can make a lot of different things out of it, including select dropdowns. So let's go ahead and actually use this one over inside of our code sandbox. I'm going to swap out field right here. Input gets switched over to field. Same as with down below. The button down below is going to stay exactly the same, no need to change that. And when we use field, we can remove the boilerplate. So value and onChange go away, and we're left with just the stuff specific to that input. We've removed all boilerplate from the mix. Now, if we go ahead and save things, once again, we haven't changed the functionality. We've just reduced the amount of code that we have to maintain. So right here, I can still have my email and my password. I can still submit the form, and I still get the data. So now that we're using form and field, I want to continue talking about other real-world things that our forms are going to do. And we're going to explore validation in just a second. First up, let's get some other field types in here. We're going to have a checkbox for our newsletter opt-in and a select drop-down where the user can pick the plan they want to join on. We're going to create a new field for the checkbox. We are going to still provide type. The type for this one would just be checkbox, and we are going to provide a name, the unique identifier. I'm going to call this one newsletter. Now with the checkbox, we have to provide the checked property instead of the value property. This is how React set things up. So we do still have to provide checked right here, setting it equal to the value, which would be values.newsletter. And this is very similar to what we did for the value prop for our inputs before we converted them over to fields. Perfect. So before we actually go ahead and save this, let's make sure we have newsletters set up. Down below, inside of map props to values, I'm going to set up newsletters. Newsletter singular. I'm going to allow it to come from a prop by providing that. Or in this case, we're going to default it to true. We're a grimy company. We automatically check that box. Now we can go ahead and destructure newsletter and actually test things out. So if I save the program, we can see the checkbox is checked by default. If I switch this over to false, we should see it unchecked by default. Perfect. And this is where we're going to leave things. Now we do want to provide a label for this, a label that's clickable. So I will open label above the field, and I will close label after the checkbox field. This is exactly what I would do with a regular checkbox if I wasn't using React and I wasn't using Formik. And then we can just provide some text. Join our newsletter. Now we have the text alongside of the checkbox. We can either click the checkbox itself or the text to toggle the value. And once again, this data is going to get submitted alongside of the other stuff. So if I type some values in, and click submit, we now get all three. We have newsletter either true for checked or false for unchecked. The last field we're going to add for this form is a select dropdown. We're going to allow the user to pick between a free or premium plan when they sign up. So right here, once again, we are going to be using field. Whoops, that is capital F field. We're going to open and close it. This time, since we do want to put some stuff inside of there, what we're going to put inside of there is the individual options. So if I wasn't using Formik, I would have a select tag with option tags inside. If I am using Formik, I have a field tag with option tags inside. Right here for field, all we need to provide is component equal to select to actually set up the support for the select dropdown, and name equal to, in this case, we can pick whatever we want. I'm going to call this one plan, and we'll have the value either be the string free or the string premium. Let's go ahead and set up a couple of options, one for each. First up, option. This option will have a value equal to free. This will be the actual programmatic value, and the text value will just be a capitalized version of that. And we can do the exact same thing for our premium plan down below. Option equals, value equals for the option. And we're going to set the value for this one equal to premium. We'll have the text be premium as well. and then we can just close off that option tag. Now, once again, we can provide a default value, either the string free or the string premium down below. We're going to set that up. And you will find yourself coming here for every single new field. So for this one, we got our plan. We can come from the plan prop. Otherwise, we can default it to whatever we like. We could, for the moment, default it to premium just to make sure it's actually working. So right here, we'll start off at premium. Let me also go ahead and destructure plan in case it is actually passed in. Now, if we save things, we should see our select dropdown. It is starting at premium. I could also change the default value to free if I wanted to, and I think that is a better default, so I'll set that up. And there we go. Now free shows up when the form actually renders. Now we have some real world fields in place. We're able to set up those initial values. We're able to do something when someone submits the form. What I want to focus on now is a very important topic, that is validation. We're going to figure out how we can set up validation for those inputs. These two don't need validation. These two do. Not only do we want to validate that something was typed in, for the email, we want to make sure it was an email. For the password, we might have our own requirements. For example, a length requirement or a character requirement. We're no longer using handle change, so I actually can go ahead and remove that. For the moment, all we're actually using is values, and we're only using it because we've set up the checkbox field. All right, so with validation, there are a couple of things we're going to do. We're not going to worry about rendering errors yet, although we will do that. For the moment, we're going to focus on setting up our validation schema. And for that, we are going to use the Yup library that we defined. Yup is super easy to work with. It allows you to chain together method calls to create a schema for each individual field. So let's just go ahead and scroll down to one of the examples to get a quick taste for what we're getting into. So right here, for example, we have our schema object. We define that this is an object. We then define what's inside of the object. We have a name. It is a string. It is required. We have an age. It is a number. It is required. It is a positive integer. We have an email. It's a string. It conforms to the email standard. We have a URL. So as we can see, Yup gives us a lot of things that allow us to basically validate really easily. We don't have to do anything manually ourselves. No regex required. So all we're going to do is use the stuff here, but we're going to use it along with Formik, which means that we're not going to call something like isValid to check for validation. Formik does that for us. All we have to do is provide a single option inside of with Formik. Up above, if I scroll back to the table of contents and I go to the with Formik options, the ones that we're looking for is down below, all the validation related ones, and we're looking for validation schema. This is going to allow us to provide a Yup schema right as the value for this property, and it's automatically going to handle validation for us. So we're going to set that up right now over inside of the editor right here. We will have validation schema. We are then going to set this equal to, and we're going to use Yup to create a new object. That would be Yup.object, which is a method. This allows us to define that new object we're trying to validate. In this case, it's our values object. And then we get to define its shape using shape. And this is where we can provide as the object that gets passed to shape all of the fields we want to validate. Let me toss the missing comma on the end. So in here, we're going to be validating our email field, and we're also going to be validating our password field. Let's go ahead and start off with email. Email. We're going to set it equal to yup.string, as we saw over inside of the documentation. We're also going to use .email to make sure that the email string conforms to what an email should look like. And last up, we will also use required, making sure that it is provided no matter what. Now, email is just one of the fields. We're also going to add password into the mix. Now for password, we're going to have a similar set of validations. We will still use yup.string. We are still validating a string. We are also going to use required, but before we do, we're going to use min. Min allows us to define the minimum number of characters that this string should be. So in our case, we could pick whatever we want. I'm going to go ahead and pick 9 as the minimum length, and then finally .required. So with these 4 lines, setting up the validation schema property, we're able to basically add validation into the application. Formik is going to take care of everything else behind the scenes, and what it gives us access to is a set of errors. We can use those errors up above to actually render a message above the individual fields as errors occur. So let's focus on that. We're all done down here. We're now going to turn our attention up above and actually do something with the errors if and when they happen. In order to figure out if something went wrong, we need to access another prop that gets passed into our component, and this one is errors. This is very similar to values. It's an object with a bunch of key value pairs. For errors, though, the key is still the field name, like email or password, but the value is the string error to show, if any. So we can go ahead and actually use a little bit of conditional rendering to render a paragraph tag for each of the fields if there actually is an error to show. Let's start off with email right here. I'm just going to go ahead and set up a div as the wrapper for everything for this field. That's going to contain the field, but it's also going to contain either above or below it, dealer's choice, the error message if there is one. So we can use a little bit of conditional rendering. I'll use the logical AND operator for this, although the ternary operator would also work. I'm going to check errors.email. If it does exist, using logical AND, we are going to render a paragraph tag. If it doesn't exist, we're going to render absolutely nothing. In the paragraph tag, the message will just be the value, errors.email. And there we go. We'll now have that error show up if there is indeed one to show. Let's go ahead and actually test things out. I'm going to save the project over here. I'm going to type something in. And you can see that right away as we start to type, we are getting the message. Email must be a valid email. I could then make it valid by continuing to type, and then the error goes away. So maybe not the perfect user experience, but at least it is working for the moment. So the problem is that right now we haven't really finished typing, but we're still seeing the error, and we can actually clean that up as well by using the touched attributes that Formik provides you, which lets you know if a field has been visited before. And we can say that a field is only invalid if it's actually been visited. Otherwise, we're just going to let the user continue filling things out. To access that, it's just another thing that Formik passes to us. This one is called touched. And touched, like values and errors, contains an object. There's properties for each field, and it's either true or false if the field was touched or not. So for the email, we could access right here, touched. We could access touched.email to see if that field was touched. If it was touched, let's see if there is an error. If there is an error, let's go ahead and render that paragraph. Now we're going to have a very similar setup, but you can see that as I start typing the email, right away we're not getting the error, which is indeed what we want. We would only actually get the error if we were to do something like try to submit the form. Right here, it does indeed show up, and that's perfect. Now we can do the exact same thing for the password field as well. Right below, we're going to set up that div. I'm going to set up the div opener above and the closer below. We're going to indent field, and we're going to set up a paragraph tag, very similar to this. Once again, you could break this out into something reusable for your purposes. And we're just going to change in that location email to password. For touched, we'll do it for errors. And we will do it for the actual error message as well. Now we have validation for both of those fields. And before we go any further, I do just want to go ahead and actually test that it is indeed working for the password. I'm going to go ahead and save the project. Over here, we could just try to submit the form right off the bat, and we can see that password is a required field and email is a required field, both showing up because I haven't provided a value for each. If I do provide a password, you can see now it's not long enough. We have the character restriction. If I keep on going, eventually the error goes away. Now with Yup, we can actually customize all those error messages to be a little more user-friendly, and it's super easy to do. Essentially, every method that you use, whether it's string, email, required, min, these all take as an optional last argument a custom error message. So for email is not a valid email, I could say email not valid. For required, I could say email is required. And we can do the exact same thing for the password validations. For the character restriction, I could say password must be 9 characters or longer. And then for the password required attribute, we could say the exact same thing we said above. Password is required. Now we have a way to provide those custom error messages, and they're actually going to get shown to the screen. So if I submit the form right off the bat, we can see we have those errors. If I type a few characters, you can see password must be 9 characters or longer, and everything is indeed working as expected. If I have an invalid email, email is not valid shows up. So with this in place, we have a lot of great features that we would expect in all of our forms, but we still have a functional component which really does not do a whole lot. A lot of the behavior has been abstracted away to Formik, and we've just added a little bit of configuration down below to guide Formik and let it know how we want to handle things in this specific form. Now, there are a couple other things I want to talk about, and all of those relate to actually handling the submission. All of your handle submit functions are going to do something asynchronous for the most part. You might have an error that comes back from a HTTP request that can't be caught with yup. For example, email is already taken. I need to go off to the database and see if that email exists first. And we might also want to do some other stuff, like disable the submit button while we're actually making that asynchronous request. We actually can do all of that, and we're going to do all of that right now using a few methods available to us in handle submit. Now we're just going to simulate some sort of asynchronous request using set timeout. This is where you'd put your real one. We're going to run a function, and we're going to run it after a certain amount of time. Let's go with 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds. Then inside of here, we can go ahead and add some contrived validation. What we're going to do is just pick a single email address and say that that one's already taken, just to explore how all of this would work. So I'm going to go ahead and say if, and then we're going to look at the values that were submitted. Now we're just going to look at values dot email, and we're going to see if that email equals, and this is where we can pick some sort of static one since we don't have a real request to make. I'm going to use Andrew at test.io. So we're essentially saying, hey, you can't use that one. It's already in the database. So if there is an error, we'll do one thing. Else, if there is no error, we will do something else. Now, when there is an error and it's not a validation error that we can catch locally, Formik does still give us a way to set the error. So this is available to us. I'm going to pull up the docs real quick because this stuff is a little tricky. Up at the very top where we have our table of contents, we're looking for our with Formik options. We're looking for handle submit. And this gives us what's known as the Formik bag. It is a set of functions we can use inside of handle submit to get stuff done. We're going to be using set errors to set our errors. We're also going to be using things like reset form to completely reset the form after a valid submission. And we will also be using set submitting to make sure that we can disable that submit button until the asynchronous request actually completes. So let's go ahead and grab all three of those: reset form, set errors, and set submitting. Over here, those get passed in as the second argument. Now we can either go ahead and call that something like Formik bag, we could call it API, or we could just destructure those things we need, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So we'll start off with the reset form, clears all the fields, set errors, allows us to set errors, and finally set submitting. Allows us to keep track of whether the form is still waiting for the server to respond. So if there is an error, all we're going to do is use set errors. Set errors has a super simple API. We pass it an object. We have key value pairs for each field. In this case, the only field we would want to set an error for is email. So we're going to set the email error equal to, and then we just provide a value, whatever string we want. We could say that email is already taken, for example. Now we're actually going to see that error after the 2 seconds, even if the value typed in is technically a valid email. Now we can also go ahead and use reset form down below. So in this case, we'll say, hey, like the data saved, there's no need to keep it around anymore. Just go ahead and wipe the form. And now we can test all of this out. So let's go ahead and start with a completely valid form. I'm going to use Andrew at, I'll spell everything wrong, testing.com, and then I'll just add a password in, something real long. I'll click submit, and we can see we wait those 2 seconds. When the 2 seconds are up, the fields are cleared, and that's great. That is cleared because we used reset form. Now let's go ahead and use Andrew at test.io. Andrew at test.io, any password we like, that doesn't matter. I'm going to click submit. We wait those 2 seconds once again. This time though, when we come back, we can see that email is already taken, is showing up. So here we're able to set custom errors. If something does go wrong from our asynchronous request, we're able to clear the form if everything goes well. Now we can also disable the form so it can't be submitted again. It also provides a nicer user experience. We could disable the button. We could add a loading indicator. We could conditionally render anything we want. At its core, though, what we need to do is access a prop that's passed to our component. It's called isSubmitting. And as the name suggests, it's a Boolean. If we are submitting, it's true. If we're not submitting, it's false. And I'm just going to use that on my button right here. I'm going to set disabled conditionally to disable that button. We'll use our JavaScript expression. And then all we're going to do is access isSubmitting. So if we are submitting, the value will be true, in which case disabled will be true. If we're not submitting, isSubmitting will be false, in which case the button won't be disabled, allowing the user to actually start up a submission. Now, with our asynchronous handle submit functions, we have to tell Formik when we're actually done, when the asynchronous request is ready, and we can allow the user to submit a form again. And we're just going to do that right here. After reset form, after the closing curly brace for else, we will use set submitting, and we will just set it equal to false. This is going to allow us to actually manage that state based off of our asynchronous request. So this time around, let's go ahead and submit the form. I will use Andrew at testing.io, which is valid. And then I'm going to go ahead and enter whatever password I like. I'm going to submit the form. We're going to wait those 2 seconds, but keep an eye out for this button. You can see it's actually disabled right now and I can't click it. When we wait those 2 seconds and everything goes well, we use set submitting to make sure the button can be clicked again for the next submission. So this is Formik at a glance. Formik does have a lot of other cool stuff, and I invite you to go ahead and explore that as you integrate it into your application. One of the things that I really liked about Formik when I was first getting started is that I was able to tweak individual components one form at a time. So I think at the time I switched to Formik, my application was pretty small still. I think maybe I had 7 different forms throughout the application. And there was one form in particular that actually inspired me to look for a third-party solution, and that's the form I started with. Now, I didn't just do all 7 right away in one commit. I did some other stuff. I added some new features, and a few days later, I added a few more and a few more as I went. So with Formik, you can really tweak things as you go. You don't have to be all or nothing. If you are using just regular React, or you are using some other library you're not happy with, I do invite you to actually check it out and integrate it into your application. As always, if you do have any questions, leave a comment down below. I do check in on those, and I'd be more than happy to help. If you want to get more stuff like this, you can subscribe over at me.io. There you can find a link to all of my other videos as well as my YouTube channel. I invite you to subscribe to that channel too, and you'll be notified very infrequently about new mini courses like this. Always high quality content. I try to keep it interesting, engaging, and useful. That's all for this one. I'll see you next time.